Welcome everyone. The webinar will begin shortly and will be recorded. We invite for you to connect with the campaign for grade level reading on social media and by tweeting any thoughts or reflections you may have using the hashtag #LearningTuesdays. Okay, once again, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Sierra Sanchez and I'll be behind the scenes helping to produce this conversation. I have a few housekeeping details before we get started. First, we would love for you to introduce yourself using the chat box at the bottom of the screen and to post any questions you might have in the Q&A box, as we'll be dedicating the closing portion of this webinar to respond to those questions. This webinar is being recorded and live streamed on Facebook, and the recording, as well as any resources you see shared in the chat, will be combined and shared with you in a follow-up email to all webinar registrants. Finally, we'll be having a brief poll as well as a few other polls during the session, and highly encourage your responses to those for participation and engagement, as well as our commitment to continuous improvement. And before we begin, I'd like to call your attention to our upcoming webinars. Next week on November 8th, we'll have an exciting doubleheader, starting with a rebroadcast on our YouTube channel at 12:30 Eastern Time, followed by a session on Beyond the Headlines, What Can We Learn from a Closer Look at NAEP. The following week, we'll start off at 12:30 with a funder-to-funder conversation on the critical role of professional development, followed by another learning loss recovery challenge on safety and belonging first, advancing well-being for learning recovery. Information and registration for these will be posted in the chat box now, and we hope you can join us. Joining you now is John Gomperts, Senior Fellow with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Thank you and enjoy the webinar.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining, and welcome to yet another episode of the campaign's Learning Tuesdays. I'm excited about today's session, and it gets right to some of the key challenges we're facing now. As always, thanks to Sierra for such a terrific job in putting this all together and making it so seamless. For the past week now, we've spent a lot of time reading about the NAEP scores and what they are, what they mean, and what we should be doing in response. And we are getting today to bring some of that conversation to a head, including trying to get some national experts to be very specific about what communities and organizations and communities can and should be doing right now. We have a great lineup of guests today, so let me briefly introduce them. And Sierra, maybe you can put up the slide now with their bios. Longer bios are available in the chat, and I'm going to just do quick identifications. So we have Mark Schneider, who we'll start with, who's the director of the Institution of Education Sciences at the Department of Education. And in a second, you're going to learn what that is. Rebecca Griffiths is a researcher at SRI Education and a key player in the new Learn Network. You will also learn about the Learn Network. Erin Mote is the co-founder and CEO of Innovate EDU, and she is deeply involved in the XPrize, which we'll hear about just shortly. And Deborah Peart is the founder of My Mathematics Mind, and who's going to help us think what to do about the lagging scores in math. It's a great group to help us think about what to do in the wake of the NAEP results. But before we get to our guests, let me just take a moment to talk about these NAEP results. They were neither good nor surprising. I think we'd all agree about that. They confirm and document what we basically knew, which is that kids fell behind during the pandemic, and that the impact was most particularly profound among those young people who were already challenged at succeeding in school. So yeah, we got it. And the NAEP scores really showed that. Just a couple of days ago, a Stanford-Harvard consortium released a report that turns the NAEP results into a calculation of just how far kids fell behind in terms of time. There's a link to that. We'll post a link to that in the chat. But these folks at Stanford and Harvard created a map that allows each of us to drill down in states and communities across the country to get a sense of that time gap, whether it's measured in weeks or months. Again, the link to the study is in the chat, and we'll also post it with the recording. While the headlines and editorials seem to be screaming about the NAEP results and calling them an emergency, others have had different reactions. In the New York Times, editorial writer named David Wallace Wells wrote that these results aren't especially surprising. What exactly did we expect was going to happen? And he points out, importantly, I think, that have we actually forgotten just about how terrible and terrifying the pandemic was? Look, he's not happy about the NAEP results, but he's not especially surprised. And he reminds us that while these NAEP results are very, very disappointing, more than 1 million Americans died. And there were moments at which we thought it might be a lot worse than that. So yeah, he says, these results aren't great, but they're also not surprising, and they are not a tragedy or an emergency on the level of 1 million people dying. He also agrees, by the way, that we should take this learning loss seriously and take the measures that will work to make up the time and learning that was lost. Again, the Wallace Wells piece will be posted in the chat as well, and I recommend it. Our good friends at EdTrust sort of agree with Wallace Wells and with us, I think, and they said, this is not the time for hand-wringing, but it is the time for action on things that we know work for accelerating learning. And as always, EdTrust has excellent recommendations in this regard, which very much align with what the campaign has been advocating and we've been all learning about together. So we'll post the EdTrust work as well. That quote from EdTrust is actually a great lead-in to our conversation today, I think. And we have some terrific guests to help us make sense of what's going on and also to advance some clear ideas about what needs to happen now. Also, we're going to post a couple of questions in the course of this conversation, and I hope you will respond because that will loop back into the conversation and help shape the conversation as it develops over this next 90 minutes or so. And we'll have our traditional question and answer session later in the meeting. So please post those questions in the Q&A function. So very, very much appreciate all of that engagement. Now, let's turn to our guests, starting with Mark Schneider from the Institute of Education Sciences. I warn you that Mark is straight talking and blunt, and I have specifically asked him not to tone it down for us, to give us the straight stuff. So Mark, welcome, and thanks for joining us. And please turn on your, oh, there you are.
I'm here.
All right,
so
great.
But thank you for that introduction, because now if I want to moderate anything, I feel
You'll be
guilty.
You'll be a fraud if you're too moderate. You'll be a fraudulent version of yourself. So thanks very much for joining us today, Mark. So let's start out with who you are. Like, where'd you grow up and how'd you get into this bag?
How'd I get into this? Well, let's see. So I was born and raised on the Lower East Side of Manhattan, back when it was the mean streets, not the yuppified version that it is today. I was a feral child. My parents, I had 2 brothers and a sister, and they forgot about me. I was a middle child. It was the best thing that ever happened to me. So that was it. I the usual things, went to college, graduate school. I taught for 3 years in a middle school. It was at the end of 3 years, I was either going to kill myself or kill a student. It was the hardest job I've ever had in my entire life. I've never worked so hard, the ability of people to do this for year after year and do great jobs at it is beyond, obviously beyond my capabilities. I lasted 3 years. Then, then I went to Chapel Hill, got my PhD, became a university faculty member in 2000. And by the way, being a faculty member is not the easiest job, but compared to teaching in a middle school. And there were times when I would just do an experiment. I would say, how boring could I be just to see what students would do, right? And they didn't throw chairs. They didn't, they didn't have fist fights. They sat there and they were bored out of their minds. But it was never, they were just so, what's the right word, constrained in the behavior compared to a 14-year-old boy. Woo.
I find it very hard to imagine that you were a boring professor, but I don't know.
It was an experiment.
So then how did you arrive at the Department of Education, and tell us what the Institute for Educational Sciences is? Okay,
there's no AL at the end, education science.
Okay, education science.
So, right. So in 2003, I was finishing a book on charter schools, and DC was a major hub of charter schools. So I came to DC to finish the book, and I was working part-time for the Institute. And then about halfway, I was supposed to be here for a year, and this was again 2003. So now we're up to 2023. I'm still here. So that year just sort of grew and grew and grew. So I was the commissioner for the National Center for Education Statistics for a little over 3 years. Then I went to work for the American Institutes of Research as a vice president and Institute fellow. And then this job came up, and I was very lucky to get it. So I'm 4.5 years into the term. It's a 6-year term. Okay, so what is the Institute? So the Institute has 4 centers in it. It has the National Center for Education Statistics, which is probably the best known. And part of NCS's job is to administer NAEP, the National Assessment of Education Progress, which you mentioned earlier. We have the National Center for Education Evaluation and Regional Support. And that is that runs the What Works Clearinghouse, a major resource. It runs ERIC, and even actually, I think it's the most widely used website in the Department of Education. And it runs the regional education laboratories, the RELs. Plus, it does all the evaluation work. Not all the, most of the major evaluation work goes through that center. We have the National Center for Education Research, which is one of the biggest investors in education research year after year after year. It's made the 2 largest commitment areas of investment are, one, social emotional learning, which actually, it's gone by many names. It's been up, it's been down. And I'm just going to tell a personal story. My granddaughter came home from school. Right? You remember school? She was in school. She came home and she said, I can't do it. She's 8 years old. She said, I can't do it. I don't understand how to learn anymore. I don't understand how to be in a classroom. I feel stupid and I feel dumb. And and my daughter told me the story. And look, this is, quite frankly, upper middle class family, supported the kids the whole time, right? That daughter has two girls. Supported them the whole time. They were in learning pods, everything. And the damage to both of them is just, so the younger one just came home and said, I feel stupid. I don't know how to learn anymore.
Wow.
It was so, and this is not a dumb kid. And this, again, a kid with amazing resources, a good school district, the whole thing, right? And I said, what, God, this is just awful.
Yeah.
Right.
Wow.
It's truly awful. So, and the other area, as you all know, is that we've invested a lot of money in reading. And reading for me is the biggest puzzle in all of education science research, because we know how to teach reading. We've known how to teach reading for a long time. And then, the reading wars are back. I'm sure most of the people on the call know about Emily Hanford's work, which just opened my eyes to that world. So we've tried many times to figure out how to, this is your bread and butter. If we know the science of reading, why isn't it being implement it,
Yeah.
right?
All right. We're going to come back to that in a second. So one last question about IES.
I'm sorry, the last center I don't
Oh,
want
yeah.
to neglect it is the National Center for Special Education Research.
Oh, right. Okay. So let me ask just one question. You're in the Department of Education, but there's a way in which you're quasi-independent. Can you explain that? What the relationship of IES is to the department?
Right. So in 2002, the institute was set up, right?
Mhm.
And our founding legislation is ESRA, the Education Sciences Reform Act. And so the whole goal in that was to create a research institute that's associated with the Department of Education, but is not, I'm going to say not part of it, but not integral to most of the work in the department, right? So the goal of ESRA was to set up rigorous scientific, an agency, the Institute, to pursue in a nonpartisan manner, rigorous education research.
Excellent.
And we've done it, right? I mean, the NCR, of course, is the major research wing of IES. And we spend, depending on the year, $100 million more on funding research. It's all scientific merit. It's all based on peer reviews. And it is, I mean, it's rigorous work. To bridge to where we're going, there's several fundamental problems with education research. So the first one is implementation. So this is where reading for me is the classic example.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, I see the NAEP reading results and I want to cry. I mean, it's just like, depending on the year and the grade, but I mean, and I'm very much concerned with the below basic percentages.
Yep.
So, so somewhere between a quarter and over a third of American students, depending on fourth or eighth grade, I don't remember the numbers offhand, are below NAEP basic.
Right.
I mean, think about that, below NAEP basic, even higher percentages below NAEP, below NAEP basic in mathematics. And the disaster of the last 2 years of COVID was that those scores are, that percentage below basic went up by 7 to 9%, depending on the test and the subject and the grade. You know, so, and as you've noted, the scores went down across the board, but the percent below basic is something we've been seeing increasingly. So the students at the top are holding their own, maybe go up a point, go down a point, but mostly stable. But the bottom is just going like that.
So I was going to ask you, Mark, what you just answered the question. What jumped out at you? Yes, we know scores went down by this and that amount overall, but what jumped out at you was the rise in below basic, the bottom dropping out, basically.
It's the bottom dropping out. And you know, so we've seen this in science, we've seen this, which we didn't test last year, or earlier this year. We've seen this in math, we've seen this in reading. And at some point, it just gets, I mean, I'm going to say, for me, it gets scary.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, if we're thinking about, and, you know, below basic, so part of the problem is that we don't know how far below basic they are. There's been a problem over the last 20 years when we've been so much more concerned with proficiency and advanced because of the No Child Left Behind of 2002. And we've been neglecting below basic. But all you have to do, like since the day I walked in here, it's like, no, below basic is I mean, look, we need, you know, gifted and talented education. We need
the whole thing.
We need the whole thing. But if a third of our students, and then if you talk about Black students and Hispanic students, we're talking about 2/3 are below basic in science. Like, I mean, where are we going to get the STEM workforce of the future? Where are we going to get a diverse, strong, big STEM workforce if so many of our students are below basic in science and in mathematics?
So I don't think that you and I are very qualified to discuss hair on fire situations. But if you had hair,
no, I did have hair, and it's been on fire so long that it's all gone.
This is the thing that you would be looking at, the bottom dropping out, the increase in below basic. And, you know, for me, my last assignment in this life was running America's Promise Alliance, which ran the Grad Nation campaign. And those are the young people who are obviously most at risk for not completing high school. And we know all the bad outcomes that are associated with that.
But it's even worse.
Okay, great.
No.
See, I told you he was going to be blunt. Go ahead.
Well, because I mean, increasingly, so NCS does this state mapping study.
Yep.
Right. And if you don't know it, you people don't know it. I mean, you're shaking your head, so you do know.
Yep.
So what
Yes.
it does is it so Arnie Duncan, like, has repeatedly said that states are lying to their citizens. Education systems are lying. He's written a book about this, right?
Yeah. Right.
So one of the most important spotlights on how much that lie is the NAEP mapping study. I mean, I was in Virginia a couple of days ago talking to the Board of Education. They have one of the campaigns that they're talking about is the honesty gap, right? So at least on test scores, they're like 6 or 7, which is not bad. It's going down. Of course, they want to be number 1, but their standards are so low. Their standards are so low that there may be 2 or 3 times as many students are found proficient in the state, compared to the NAEP proficiency standard. We find this all over the place. So in some of the, in some big city school districts, the NAEP finds 10% of the students proficient, and the state shows them 60% proficient.
Yep. Well, this is a hard thing. And I want to come in a second to what you're suggesting and talk specifically about reading. But I just saw a study this morning where 95% of parents in this study think their kids are pretty much back to where they were. And look, nobody loves somebody, standing on some institution steps and saying, your kids are doing really, really poorly. That's just not going to be, any more than we would like people talking about our blood pressure in public or anything else. So the delta between how parents are metabolizing and understanding and observing how things are going and how educators are seeing them, that's a scary delta, and it can remove sort of political will.
So yes, so I mean, this of course is a serious problem, but I mean, this is a very long-standing issue, right?
Yeah.
So when we ask parents to assign grades, there's 85-90% of them give A's to their schools, but they give D's and C's to the school system.
Yeah, right.
But I mean, so again, I'm sorry to go back to both my daughters, very passionate about education, right? But the 2 years that they spent watching what was going on with their kids and trying to balance being full-time workers and full-time parents, they came out of the pandemic with pretty much a different view of schools than they went into it.
Say one more sentence. How so different?
Well, I mean, so they were really beginning to question, like, is this the education that they should be getting?
Interesting. Right? All right, let's talk a little bit about reading and your comment that it makes you cry. After we get done with the hair on fire, we're going to move through all of you. It makes you cry to see these reading scores when, in fact, in your view, personal and institutional view, like, we actually know what to do about this. So talk about that a little bit.
So it may have been you, but someone recently described the American education system as in the following terms: if you wanted to design the most complex system that you could possibly imagine, just start with the American education system, right? Yeah. There are like 16,000 school districts, 14 depending on how you count them. There's, let's say, 16,000 school districts, which are major actors. There's 50 states plus the District of Columbia plus some of the outlying territories. The federal government's role is constitutionally limited, right? But you're talking about a proliferation of governments that are, some are elected, some are appointed. I mean, it's a total mishmash. Some of the school districts are extremely small, right? 1, 2 schools in the district, and some are extremely large. New York, the LAUSD,
Mhm.
And the federal government has some leverage points, right? It has money. But most of the decisions are being made at the local level, state and
Yes.
local level,
Yes.
right?
Of
So they're
course.
districts, and then districts have, they have to deal with their schools. So it's an incredibly complicated system,
Yep.
right? With and it's states that have most of the power, right? And again, constitutional system.
Yep. Yep.
Right. The districts have, and the districts have. So one of the problems I've had with education research is like that complexity is not fully captured.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to do something, which we tried, like, okay, how can we best intervene in schools of education and teacher training to make sure that reading is taught to the teachers. So when the teachers go out into the world, they've been trained in the best methods. We spent the pandemic didn't help, but we spent like a year trying to get together the best reading specialists in the country, and the idea was to try to get an RFA that would enable us to invest, I don't know, $15-20 million, whatever it would have been, into intervening with schools of education to try to speed up good education, teaching of reading. And quite frankly, we never went forward with it because it was just too hard to figure it out.
So one huge impediment is how diffuse responsibility is across this, and how local it is. If you think about that, we'll talk for a second about science of reading and your belief that right now we have a really, really clear idea of what needs to happen. And then
So I don't know any field in education research where we don't have hard science, right? And I'm talking about brain scans, I'm talking about neuroscience, I'm talking about behavior science, I'm talking about observation, I'm talking about da.
Yep.
Right? We go on and on and on and on.
Yep.
And I don't know any field in education research where the data and the evidence is so strong.
Okay.
But then, so what happens is then, well, I mean, again, I'm relying on Emily Hanford's work on this, who's done some, some of the greatest investigation work on
For
this
sure.
that we have now.
For sure.
And part of the problem is, look, when my kids were little, every night they sat on my lap and I read often the exact same book.
Yeah, of
right?
course. Of course.
Again. No, can't we read something else? No, again, and then, and hours upon hours and they're both avid readers. And, I mean, I'm an avid reader, they are. And, so you think, well, that's the way kids learn to read, right? You give them good books, you sit with them, you read them and you over and over. But I mean, again, there's when I start talking about this, there's a certain amount of privilege involved in this, right? I mean, when I was a kid, I was dirt poor, but I came from an intact family and a very strong cultural support of reading and education. But anyway, but the point is, that's not the way that humans learn how to read, right?
Yeah.
So why isn't phonics every place?
Right. So let's take it all the way to the ground level, and then I'm gonna switch and well, I'm gonna do two things in a second. But our audience today, and for these Learning Tuesdays, is largely made up of community coalitions, community organizations, local educators, funders in local communities, who probably subscribe to everything that you say. We'll see what people say. And like, what would you recommend they do with this knowledge that exists and is not being acted on?
So, it is actually a campaign that we need to launch, right?
Mm-hmm.
So some of the, so the 3 years that I should have been arrested for malpractice in teaching, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I walked into the schoolroom, I walked into my classroom, I closed the door, right? And whatever went on in that classroom was on me, right?
Yep.
And I mean, it was crazy, right? I mean, I was 22 years old, more than insane for the, for a normal 22-year-old. And they were giving me like 150 kids under my supervision. And I had teacher training. That's how I was able to get an emergency certification. But I was locked in a room like, hey, yeah, here, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, it turned out, I mean, actually, in all seriousness, I mean, I wasn't bad at it. I just couldn't do it. But the problem is, like, this is insane. I should not have should not have the authority to make up my own curriculum.
Yep.
Right. And and actually, when I was teaching at the university level, probably the same thing. Right.
Yep.
I just, like, oh, we're going to pay you a lot of money, and you make up the curriculum, you make up the you design, da da da. Well, I'm sorry, there are curriculum designers, there's education science, there's learning science.
Right.
So I think so. I'm sorry. What to answer your question? It unfortunately requires limitations on the ability of teachers to make up and teach whatever they want.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And you would put a lot of weight then on pressing for teacher training.
Teacher training,
all the way down at the sort of where it happens, where teaching happens. People should be saying, "Hey, are these folks trained appropriately?
Are they trained appropriately?" So again, so the state of Virginia, again, I've just happened to spend some time there, so I know. I mean, they have a commitment to changing all the curriculum, the reading curriculum in the schools of education, right? And so the problem, of course, is then the states have to then control their school districts, right?
Yep.
And so Virginia is a big state, but it's county school systems. So it's a little easier than if you go into like the Northeast, where you have, hundreds of school districts.
Or Phoenix, where you've got so many and, all over Arizona. Yeah. Okay, Mark, thank you so much. As we're going to come back to you shortly. I want to invite Erin to join us, but as we sort of pivot here to Erin, I want to, Sierra, if we can post the poll, the first question around what people think are the barriers to adoption of evidence-based practice, that would be super helpful. So if people would fill this out, then we're going to pivot to Erin. So Erin, I'm going to ask you to join on screen, and I'm going to go off screen for 1 second because I dropped my piece of paper that has my notes on it. So Erin, let's start with the question of, we're going to talk to you about the XPrize in a second, but I can't have you on here without giving you the opportunity to say a little bit about Innovate EDU.
Well, thanks, John. Go grab that paper. And
I'm going to get the paper and you talk, okay?
I will stretch, as we call it in the industry. Well, thanks so much for having
me. Perfect. I didn't want to miss anything.
Well, thanks so much for having us. I'm Erin Mote. I'm the Executive Director of Innovate EDU. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the XPrize, but it's worthwhile to talk a little bit about some of the other work that Innovate EDU does. Please. In particular, as I'm reading folks who are coming on in the chat and introducing themselves, I'm so excited to see so many community-based organizations and tutoring organizations, because one of the alliances that Innovate EDU is a leader in is the National Partnership for Student Success, which was launched at the White House in July and really answers President Biden's call for 250,000 more tutors, mentors, student support coordinators, student success coaches, post-secondary transition coaches to be supporting schools and teachers, after school programs, and our young people at this time. And so if you want to learn more about the National Partnership for Student Success, I would really encourage you to do that. There's also free technical assistance there for any program, state, district who's looking to create these supports for young people from some leading organizations in the country. And that work of NPSS really bringing a coalition of more than 100 organizations now together under the NPSS banner is emblematic of the work that Innovate EDU is really doing, which is to create uncommon alliances and coalitions to drive large-scale systems change within education. And so,
well, you only just heard Mark give you your marching orders. he said we need a campaign, and that part of what would help people at the local level work this issue is if there were a national campaign. So there you go.
Well, check. We're doing that with the National Partnership for Student Success. And actually, I'm really excited about some of the early days of NPSS, which is the acronym we use, because what's a great DC initiative without a good acronym?
By the way, we had Bob and Kate on about a month ago, who were fantastic and talked a lot about NPSS. And I know that there's a lot of interest in it in our network for sure.
Well, great. We'll reach out. I think one of the things that we're really excited about is some of the early success that we're seeing and the early engagement we're seeing around really dynamic programs that are bridging what I would call the traditional silos in K-12, in school and out of school, subject matter areas. And I want to shout out some of the great programs that are already happening in New Jersey, where they're actually working with teaching candidates who are undergraduate teaching candidates, activating them as tutors across the state of New Jersey. And the state of New Jersey in January will launch a statewide tutoring program with their ARP ESSER dollars that was seeded with some philanthropic dollars, so that every school community in New Jersey has access to tutors, mentoring, student success coaches, and some of those dynamic post-secondary transition support. So really excited about those early days. But I'm here to talk about the XPrize today, which is something that Innovate EDU has been pleased to support, and I've been pleased to support as a judge. Don't worry, I'm not going to give out any of the secrets of the judging process. I've raised my right hand, and so can't do that. But I'm really excited to talk about the XPrize and how it intersects with some of the challenges that Mark talked about, not just in terms of what research we're thinking about and how we think about who's at the research table, but frankly, the speed at which we're able to deliver solutions to the field, and we're able to say, this is what works for whom, when, and under what conditions.
So say a little bit more about what this XPrize undertaking is, Erin.
Yeah, so I promise Mark didn't give me a quarter to do this. Maybe it would be inflation now with $1, but the XPrize, Mark partnering with the XPrize here, I think is just a really great example of the very best of what government can do when they think about uncommon alliances or new partners. And here, it's not a $50 million grant. It's $1 million for a digital learning challenge that's really set to modernize, accelerate, and improve the ways that we are able to identify effective tools that have outcomes on student learning. And one of the things that I think is really important about the digital learning challenge, and again, saying that it's digital, it's really focused on ed tech and digital learning platforms, is it's really focused on rapid, reproducible experiments that can add quickly to a research base around what works for whom, when, and how. And so how do we collect, how do we analyze, and how do we understand the data so that we're able to action interventions much, much quicker and be much more responsive? And I think that's actually one huge disconnect, if I speak in the spirit of radical candor, that happened during COVID, which is teachers, superintendents, others were doing everything they could to ask the right questions. What do I do for my young people right now and in this moment? And I'm a mom of 2 kids, 4 and 7. So I was watching my son's teachers, Robert is his name, Robert's teachers try to do this, try to figure out how to teach kindergarten and teach pre-K4 in a digital learning environment. What were the right tools? What was the right amount of time for them to be on screen? What was the right mix of activities? And those teachers and other folks doing their darndest. And I just want to experience and express my like undying gratitude, not just to Robert's teachers, but to everybody who really leaned in, from our schools, our tutors, our superintendents, our educators, our bus drivers, our cafeteria workers, our office workers, our social workers. The list goes on and on. Like, it is miraculous and amazing what happened. And yet they're still being confronted with this really, really dire news with NAEP. And I know from talking to some superintendents, it's been a really hard couple weeks. They've
No
known
kidding.
this, they felt this, but
Yeah.
now it's all over the front
It's
page.
documented, it's on the
Yeah.
front pages, and people are, I mean,
Are
people
screaming
are
at
upset.
them.
Yeah, and people are upset for good reason, but I mean, yeah, exactly. Doesn't
But
make
I
it
think your
easier to
comments
work.
are really important, like the context. Listen, we almost quit kindergarten, right? In my house, just because it was just so hard.
Yeah.
And so how do we take this moment that feels really, really hard and say, what can we do better? How can we step back, and how can we say, how does research and how we're mobilizing knowledge and disseminating knowledge, how must it change so that when this happens again, and listen, whether it's a snow day or a natural disaster
Something's
or
gonna
a
happen, right.
hurricane,
Yeah.
this is going to happen again.
Yeah.
And we need to be better prepared to serve our communities and get that knowledge, get that research, and mobilize that understanding on the ground. And I think XPrize is attempting to do that. We're in our final stages. So we're really at the place where we've selected some finalists. They're out there, they're doing these rapid cycle experiments in school districts with tools, but stay tuned.
The last question I was going to ask you is, you talk about rapid cycle and all these things happening. When are we going to hear about and experience some of the outcomes that you're hoping for?
Yeah, so I actually think we already are. So can I say some things that might be a little bit, I'm going to push a little here. Good. Is, I think Mark's intention, and Mark, I'm not meaning to speak for you, and you can correct me and hack me in the Q&A, but I think Mark's intention in creating the XPrize was really to think about new, nimble approaches and invite more voices to the table, and invite folks who might not be thought of in a traditional research context to the table, whether they were technologists or enterprise architects, university teams, or community organizers. And so we saw this like amazing response to the XPrize. And while we're at the finalists right now, it's really important to say there was a huge diversity of teams. But I think what we can say is actually if we can figure out ways to surface this information sooner, and with these more sort of rapid cycles and approaches, we can actually know what's happening. So I remember speaking with Zern in June of 2020, and it was a group of us who were on a call. And I remember looking at some of the early data from Zern, which is an ed tech company. And, the bottom dropping out that Mark talks about, this, what I would consider this sort of K-shaped result. Zern was already tracking that K-shaped data. They already knew in June 2020 that the bottom was falling out, that for our most disenfranchised students, for our students who were furthest from opportunity, the bottom was falling, and it was getting worse and worse and worse. And so how can we take research from an ed tech company, which has massive amounts of data? 1 in 4 kids are using Zern in this country right now. And how do we rapidly surface that information to decision makers, policymakers, and superintendents in the field? And so that we can say, these are our educated hypotheses about maybe what you should be trying. And not necessarily one tool or one method, or, there's no silver bullet in technology in terms of the ed tech tool to solve them all. But there are some approaches that Zern was testing in that early time of June 2020 and then throughout the next year that actually resulted in the bottom not being so drastic in the fallout in terms of learning recovery and frankly thriving. And their focus on acceleration is a really good example of a place where if we could have rolled that out sooner rather than just being focused on remediation, that could have maybe helped folks make some decisions this year about what strategies, what tools, and what techniques they were putting at play in their educational planning for recovery.
That's really interesting. Okay, great. That was awesome. You triggered a whole bunch of questions in my mind, but I'm going to go to Rebecca and then Deborah, and then we're going to all join and have a conversation. Rebecca, are you coming on screen?
Yep.
Awesome. Thank you.
So John.
Thanks for joining. Just to remind folks, we have Rebecca Griffiths from SRI Education, and SRI Education is running the Learn Network. So, Rebecca, what's the Learn Network?
So the Learn Network is led by SRI International, which is a nonprofit research institute where I work, and it is comprised of 4 product teams, what we call product teams, which have developed evidence-based products or practices that have the potential to help address some of the learning loss caused by COVID.
Okay.
Our mission with this network is to help them adapt and prepare their products or practices for scaling. To revert back to one of the comments Mark made earlier, I think one of the challenges that we as an education research community face is that we have lots of promising practices and solutions, but a lot of them never really make that leap from the laboratory to the market. And then the role of SRI in leading this network is to help our product teams to really understand the environment that they're attempting to get placed into, the needs they're trying to serve, to be sort of fit for use for teachers and educators, and to have a vision for how they're going to reach scale in the market.
So that's fantastic, and obviously extremely important. We talked about this a little before. I'm curious, when you think about doing the Learn Network, we posted the poll, and Sierra and Becky, it would be great if we could somehow get the results of that poll. I'm curious what you think as you, okay, here we are. Let's take a second while you're on screen here, Rebecca, to look at this. So we asked people to identify 2 of these and look at how just even this result is, except for one outlier, right, which is resistance to change. So as you think about what the Learn Network can do to help with adoption of things that we think are evidence-based responses to challenges, how do you think about what information and what support you provide, how you create a product that is highly adoptable as we look at those barriers and concerns?
I think there's a demand side and there's the supply side. So we're starting this work by looking at the supply side. So helping education researchers who are developing these or adapting these evidence-based products and practices to understand what the key performance indicators are for educators, what their decision criteria are when they're choosing what to use, to really understand the needs of the communities that they're serving better than I think we have in the past. I think that the hypothesis is that if we do those things, then we might overcome some of these barriers. That if we are providing educators with, say, complete solutions rather than sort of narrowly defined components of a solution, that will help to reduce the barriers to adopting the kinds of solutions that the education research community is producing.
Do you have a quick blink reaction to some of those responses that are on the screen? I can see you're looking at the screen now, but along, a lack of information and funding and skepticism and all those things. What's your hypothesis about what the biggest challenges are for broad scale adoption of evidence-based approaches?
I mean, I think it's an incredibly noisy marketplace. And so educators are faced with this sort of flood tide of new products and with vendors. Anyone can slap the words evidence-based or research-based on their products or practices.
We know this, yes.
Yeah, so it's very hard for for the products of researchers that have truly been through rigorous efficacy trials and gone through large scale RCTs to break through that. I think that's part of what one of the tasks of our network is to understand that sort of flow of information, how educators learn about the products and practices that they select, what their decision criteria are, and to look for opportunities to break through that.
I think that's really that's a really important comment, Rebecca. And Mark and Erin, I want to put you on notice that one of the things that came up in my mind, and I suspect in others' minds as we were listening to those presentations and to what you're saying, Rebecca, is, well, this thing about evidence-based, like what evidence, what level of proof are we looking for? And there's a tension, obviously, in terms of, deep research that, RCTs takes two decades to really get the results versus this XPrize rapid scale thing. And how do we balance these things? So I think that's a big question. Okay, Rebecca, I want to come back to you in a second, but I want to get Deborah into this conversation. And while we get Deborah into this conversation, let's take down the first poll. And Sierra, if you could post the second, which is much more about what would be helpful. Maybe it answers some of what we were just talking to Rebecca about. And Deborah, can you come on screen and let's I want to hear about the intersection. Well, first of all, I wanted you to tell me about my math. So, Deborah, are you there? Are you on?
I am. I'm
here.
here.
Here you are. Here you are with your awesome backdrop.
Yes.
So let's start out by just hearing a second about what you're doing, and then I want to talk about the intersection of math and literacy, and then we'll get into some more stuff.
Yeah, so I actually am a consultant in the educational spaces, and I have my own business, and I work with a team of phenomenal educators, and we support schools and teachers and leaders doing the work of understanding what it means to have a positive math identity, to understand math content deeply at the elementary level, which is often overlooked because, I can count, so I can teach kids to count. That's not true. And also, one of my favorite things is leveraging literacy for mathematical understanding, because I'm obsessed with word problems not being scary. We want story problems. I'm a big proponent of CGI, cognitively guided instruction, children learning mathematical concepts through story and relevant context. So that's a lot of the work that I do in my consulting. And
Can I ask you a question right there?
Sure.
We saw the NAEP scores, and they weren't good. They weren't good for math. As I said, I don't think we're surprised, but you can be not surprised and shocked at the same time. And maybe that's where we were. But I hear you saying something different about math, the barriers to math learning, early learning, and the barriers to reading, which is that people have more of a fear of math. Like, I can't do that. I can't do that thing. Do you think that's right? That there's more of a psychological barrier for math than there is for reading?
Absolutely. And there's plenty of research to support that many teachers and adults have math anxiety, so much so that they're thinking about actually naming it as a specific category of anxiety, because you can, it's like, it is insane. But the scary part is that a teacher who has their own math anxiety that is unresolved can project that onto their students in the way they deliver math instruction. So something I like to say to people, even with my background being in literacy. So I think it's important to say that I was a literacy lover, all things language arts. My master's was in literacy. I wanted to teach all the children how to read, and I did it. I worked with family. I did all of that. But I also noticed that very few people approached early mathematics in the same way. So once I got a little taste of, my experience was I was great at math. I didn't love it because I was not allowed to ask questions. As a little brown girl who skipped grades, I was asking questions with my little black glasses and my teachers would just stop asking so many questions and do the steps. So I turned off from it, but I still continued to excel because I could follow some rules and some procedures.
Yeah.
So I say all that to say that I'm not saying reading is not important. That's not what I'm saying. I want to make sure everyone is at ease.
Yeah.
But what I am saying is that the NAEP scores revealed declines in both reading and mathematics, the largest decline in mathematics since I think 1990. But most people have placed a greater sense of urgency on recovering in reading.
Sure.
But you know, the reading wars drone on. We love it, we hate it. Science of reading, not. Yeah, but we're going to give the resources, the attention, the support, and that's what the pattern is. Undergraduate courses. I cannot tell you how many courses I took in how to teach reading across the content areas, how to teach reading, all those things,
so then
and zero for teaching math.
So I want to come back to teaching math, but before we get all the way to math, talk a little bit about this connection that you see between early literacy and early numeracy and how they support each other. They're not separate, but they support each other. Talk a little bit about that, because I think people who are listening could use sort of the language of how you talk about this connection really powerfully to support both literacy and early numeracy.
Well, the thing is, we have to make sure that we talk about how unprepared teachers often feel on the math side, so that when we charge them with doing both, it doesn't feel overwhelming automatically. So how we roll something like that out and approach that is really important. Someone mentioned in the chat, it's undergraduate coursework, but it's also teachers right now in the classroom, whatever, you know, we can get them the aligned curricula, but we also need to make sure they're supported in the training and ongoing coaching. They have to be comfortable teaching it. They need to build up their content knowledge, and then they also need to continue to collaborate so they can become confident. So the connections that are made will make sense and won't be overwhelming. So for example, when you think about those early grades, children come to school and there are things that they can do automatically on the reading side, verbal reasoning, and they can talk about big ideas even before they can read the words on the page. And we have to be very strategic about teaching them the decoding and encoding. And the same is true on the math side, but for some reason we try to, maybe not intentionally, we strip away those natural sense-making ways of thinking on the math side because we want them to do it a specific way. I have a theory that because historically in the schools, the focus was literacy, it was reading the classics, and mathematics was reserved for the elite boys, 12 and older, that math was always a separate thing over there that was not for everyone. So the core academic skills, think about it, reading, writing, arithmetic, only computation, which is why I'm on this campaign right now, it's reading, writing, and mathing. Math deserves a verb too. So if we look at it that way and we think about training teachers in teaching children the core academic skills, it includes mathing, and it's not a separate thing over here that some children will take all the way and others just need to be able to compute. That is a part of the issue. We teach story, we teach reading strategies, and then we introduce a word problem and tell them to ignore the words. Just look for the keywords, just pluck the numbers out and do some things. Oh, the chapter told you it's an addition chapter. So if you just pull out the numbers and add them, you're good. We're not teaching them that just as we want them comprehending, we want them conceptualizing. Just as we want them having great discourse around a book that they're not ready to read, we're going to read it to them. We want them to have those experiences in math classrooms as well. To say that a curriculum is too language heavy for children to comprehend the ideas is ludicrous. If I read the story to you, you can answer questions about it. So if we play with quantities, you can engage in conversations about that as well.
Am I understanding you that the science of teaching math is lagging behind the science of reading, of how we teach reading?
In general, I would say yes, but there is some work being done. Actually, some great work being done that's even being supported by IES, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah, I know. We're gonna bring Mark.
Right?
We're gonna bring Mark back on screen in a second and make him answer for this, because I'm curious, and then I'm curious if that proposition is correct. If early literacy and early numeracy are connected and support each other, and we're moving towards a breakthrough around the science of reading, where's the science of math that can match that? Because there's a scenario in which this gets worse. Like, we get better at teaching reading and we don't get better at teaching math, and then you're really going to be mad.
Yes, and that's my point about us not looking at it as, oh no, we need to fix reading because of NAEP. Hello, math also was not okay. But I do follow the work of doctors Julie Sarama and Doug Clements, and the learning trajectories and understanding how children learn and develop number sense and early numeracy, and that mirrors some of the work on how you understand how to read and how you learn to read. I also have read just about everything Thomas Carpenter and his team of researchers have done around cognitively guided instruction and teaching math concepts, as I shared earlier, through context and story. And I think some of that work and basing our teaching on children's mathematical ideas that are already there and building on that. But teachers have to understand that. They have to be taught that. They have to be supported in that. So they can't, it's not the type of thing that you can just say, I have the right curriculum now I can run. There's more to it. There's more depth of knowledge required, but it is important to do the heavy lifting for teachers because my goodness, there's so much. So if we get them in a line curriculum where the work has been done for them, so they can focus on growing their content knowledge and making those connections, to me, that's the type of program development we need to be focusing on, is pre-K through third grade. I call it the band of foundations, because on both the math side and the ELA side, that is where if we could get them solid there, then from there we can take off.
Awesome. So let me thank you so much, Deborah. Love that. Let me invite everybody to join. We'll get the Hollywood Squares thing going here. And Mark, of course, I'm going to put you on the spot right away. What do you have to say about what Deborah said about where we are with math, what the NAEP scores tell us, and why math seems to be lagging literacy in terms of attention and knowledge about what works?
So it's an interesting question, and there's an old vaudeville line: you never want to follow a kid or a dog, right? Because you can't stand up to the appeal of those acts. So I'm following Deborah is like really tough.
She's on fire about this.
She's on fire.
Exactly. But she's trying to light a fire under your institution. Let's leave your body out of it, but under your institution.
I didn't want to, I mean, Deborah, don't mean that I compared you to a child or a dog, but I'm just like, you're really a hard act to follow. Okay. So, actually it's listening to Deborah is actually very, what's the right word? Opening. Because one of my concerns has been, we know that math and reading are declining. We know that there's a good science of reading. We know that the issue for the science of reading it's not adoption. So the No Child Left Behind Act has, emphasized reading and math, and emphasize the and emphasize the proficient, not the bottom. And we've lived with that for 20 years. So actually, again, Deborah, I'm going to have to reorient my thinking to some extent. Because the thing that I always found missing in the No Child Left Behind Act was not there was an emphasis on math. So I always found the absence of emphasis on science to be incredibly short-sighted, if you will. I mean, again, we're looking at a law that was passed 20 years ago. And the science results are just are equally horrifying as the math results. So now we know that as you get higher and higher and further along in science, it's increasingly math-based, right? So we really can't expect people to do well in science if they haven't mastered mathematical principles. But the fact of the matter is, again, Deborah, I'm going to have to, we may have to talk some more because I've been pushing a lot with science organizations, trying to get them to do. You're muted if you're yelling. If you're yelling at me, I'm not hearing you.
Deborah. Oh, let's unmute yourself, Deborah.
I got something to say.
Do you really?
I really have something to say. So there again has been research. I know we love research. There has been research done, I believe Greg Duncan, research that says it is the early math skills that are the greatest predictor of overall academic success long-term. So if we invest at the foundation level, pre-K through third grade, really birth through third grade, and we really shore them up in the math, the science will come. So if we really focus on making sure that all students, not some students, have that foundation, because there's where the reasoning and the flexibility in thinking and understanding relationships between numbers, all of those things are necessary to be great in the sciences. So math is the first. Yeah.
So let me ask you a question, because again, so just from personal experience, right? So look, I know math. I've done quite well in math, right? But the mother of my children was math phobic. Two daughters, right? Two daughters. One who ended up with an MBA, right? And actually did for a while a lot of quantitative analysis, right? But both of them were trained to be math phobic. And I invented games, we played math games, etc. But the pressure on especially girls to be math phobic was impossible, almost impossible to overcome. And I would sit with, especially my younger daughter who had aptitude for it, and I would go over stuff with her. It's almost like again, right? The same book over and over again. Well, it's harder actually to do the same math problem over and over again. But we were just lost. We were just lost with a very strong societal community pressure to be math phobic.
But that goes back to the history of who deserves to do math and who deserves to have access to math. So if I say to you, reading is hard, but you got to keep at it. Let's do it. And we celebrate reading. And your teacher says, it's reading time. And then your teacher says, it's math time. Open your textbook. First of all, your experience is vastly different. But then you also, here's where the thing happens. You get to a point where you are complaining that math is hard. And someone says, well, you can either continue taking it or you can find a major that doesn't require it. But if you want to be an engineer, you need lots of math. So I also hear, so if I don't want to be an engineer, then I don't have to do math anymore. We give too many people an out, like math is optional. Like that's why I said the core academic skills, if we treated it as reading, writing, and mathing, it wouldn't be optional. So it would be approached differently, because I dare you to go to a restaurant with your wonderful colleagues. And when they hand you the menu, say, oh, too many words. Oh, no. Someone read this for me and tell me what they're offering here. But at the end of the meal, everyone can say, oh, the tax, the tip, you just tell me what I owe and throw their credit cards in the middle. We did that. We created a society where it's acceptable to just not math. No, math deserves a verb, and we have to do something about the language around it and how we train teachers so that they can heal from their own math trauma, so that they can actually deliver math instruction with competence, confidence, and comfort.
Okay, Erin, you guys run campaigns. You just said it. And I think Deborah has just put something on your to-do list.
I'm working on my doctorate right now. Come on now, I'm doing the research.
Well, as a female engineer and enterprise architect, I will tell you that when I failed high school geometry, and geometry is still one of my worst subjects. That's okay. I'm okay with that. So is Spanish, but I speak fluent Albanian. We'll talk about language learning later and why that matters. But it's true. I mean, everything we're talking about right now is true. And the fact that we are allowing young people, families, and communities to opt out of their own potential is something that we need to call out right now. That every young person, regardless of where they live, what zip code they're in, how engaged their parents can be, we need to think about the language we use, the way we talk about learning, the way we talk about our teachers understanding concepts. It always amazes me when I talk to researchers, and I'm going to call it some researchers right now, who say to me, well, I don't think teachers can understand my research.
Oh, God.
It's not teachers' job to understand your research. It's your job to make your research understandable to teachers. Every teacher, most teachers have master's degrees. They're some of the most highly competent professionals I've ever met. And we need to treat the teaching profession like a profession. And so I think there's layers upon layers here of what Deborah is saying, both about how we talk to our kids, how we talk to our educators, and just to call it back, how we engage communities and what the research questions are today, what the research questions are for tomorrow, and how we value the voice of educators, young people, parents, and communities in setting the priorities of what we're doing. So sign me up.
All right, good.
And
Good.
I just have to tag on the importance of community and funds of knowledge and helping families recognize when they're mathing, because I can't tell you how many times people who run successful businesses and who do amazing things that require so much math say, I'm not really a math person. I'm just over here running my whole business, scaling it up and doing all kinds of mathematical things.
Yeah.
So when children are young and they're doing a puzzle and you say, look at you mathing, that mathing just becomes, that's just something I do. It's not something that I have to be invited to do. That it's just a part of the way I'm living.
Love that. Sierra or Becky, can we post the results of the second question? Because I'd like to see what people said about what would be, and I want to ask Mark and Rebecca to respond to what would be most helpful. So look, here's what is jumping out. Examples of successful implementation and funding. Then pretty even across technical support, more information, and national support doesn't do very well. So Mark, let's jump back to you and think about what would help communities do better on adopting what we're calling evidence-based practice.
So here's, and we touched on this briefly when we were talking about the XPrize, right?
Yep.
So part of the key feature of the XPrize was rapid cycle, not only experimentation, but replication, right? So why is replication so important? We've been pushing replication from the day I started, okay? Yep. Because what we do with replication, if we do it right, and this is what the XPrize was about, was you replicate in different populations, different geographies, different demographic groups, right? So for maybe the first 6, 7, 8 years of work at IES, and totally understandable, the emphasis was on main effects, right? What's the average effect? Well, that in reality, we were pushing on main effects, average effects, when medicine was going to more and more individualized medicine.
Right.
So it was a disconnect. We were even when we were pushing as hard as we could in the early 2000s, to increase the rigor of education sciences, it was wrong in the sense of looking for main effects, right? So what we need to do is we need to replicate different geographies, different demographies over and over again. That's number one, because that's the only way we're going to find out what works for whom under what conditions, right? Nobody's child is average. Every child needs an individualized attention and individualized help, right? So that's number one. Number two, the other mistake that we've done, and we call it the What Works Clearinghouse, but there are two problems with that. The first one is what I noted. That is that what works for A doesn't work for B. What works for Black kids in Chicago are not going to work for white kids in Stony Brook, New York, right? I mean, that we just have to know that.
Yep.
The second thing is, What Works Clearinghouse was like a great innovation. It was one of the first clearinghouses in the country. And many people picked up after it. But the mistake in that is it's not what works. So it's what works for whom under what conditions, but it's also going from a bright, yes, this works, and no, it doesn't work, to turn everything into a probabilistic statement, right? And this is really fundamentally important. So I go to a school and I say, look, here are a couple of interventions. None of these are guaranteed to work, but this one, given your needs, given your population, given where you are, this one has a higher probability of working than that one. So life is an experiment. We can't tell people, hey, this is going to work, because the odds are it may not. But what we need to be able to say is, here are other schools, here are other students just like yours, right, that this worked for, and we think there's a 60% chance, an 80% chance that it'll work for you. In contrast, here's another intervention, but when we match it up to your needs, it only has a 20 or 25% chance of working.
So and
that's a total difference in mindset.
But let me push you on this for a second, Mark, because when you talk about the science of reading, for instance, you're saying, oh yeah, I mean, that's for real. Everybody should be doing that. Then you're talking about other interventions where we have hints of success, maybe some early successes, but we don't have the level of confidence. So when we talk about this level of proof and adopting evidence-based, and as somebody, I can't remember who said, like everybody comes into the district office and says they got evidence-based stuff. Nobody comes in and says, we have no idea whether our thing works, but you should definitely buy it. So if you're at a community level and you're trying to sort out, forget about even the political pressure you're under, you're trying to sort out what in the world would be most helpful. Or if you're one of the people in our network who's like, what should I be advocating for? I can't advocate for everything at the same time. What should I be advocating for? How do we sort something like the science of reading, which you would put in the pantheon? Like you can write that in ink, but some of these other things you might want to write in pencil. How do we sort that out? And Rebecca, I'm interested in how you think about that in the Learn Network also, as you guys go forward.
Yeah, so why don't we turn to Rebecca first?
Okay.
Sure. Well, so I think one of the ways that we could make life a little bit easier is if we look for ways to integrate across proven practices and products. So as I think I mentioned earlier, a lot of education research is focused on testing very narrow components of a solution.
Yeah.
But that's generally not what districts are looking for. They're looking for comprehensive solutions for the population that they're serving. And so I think we can do more work of trying to help figure out how these pieces fit together. So, we're not asking people to sift through the evidence for a specific product that helps teachers teach fractions or one module.
Yeah.
And then on the implementation side, I think to Erin's point earlier, a lot of the way that education researchers publish research, like all research, is speaking to each other. So, most of our research reports, we spend 2/3 of the space talking about our methods and, information that's really not of interest to the people who are thinking about how do I actually use this? What am I going to actually do in my classroom? So I think we can kind of turn the tables in terms of the detail of information that we're providing about how to implement an intervention, a proven practice or solution in a classroom, especially when we're speaking to practitioner audiences. And as far as how we signal what high quality evidence is compared to anything else that's out there, I wish I had an easy answer to that one. I think there's, we were talking the other day about that. The idea of an FDA, and wouldn't it be nice if there was some sort of seal of approval that we could put on products that actually have IES funded or really high quality research behind them, and maybe that's a world we can move towards with the ESSA standards.
Okay, Mark, I'm coming to you in a second. I'm going to Erin first, but you better think of a good answer for this, and then I have another question after that. Erin, go ahead.
I think we need to build infrastructure that, like medicine or energy or healthcare, contemplates a spectrum of evidence. Like that is what we need to do. And actually we can turn right across the pond to our friends in the UK who have created something called the Education Endowment Foundation, which thinks about how can I disseminate knowledge and mobilize knowledge so that it's consumable by practitioners. And what they say is actually there's only a couple dimensions that matter to a superintendent, to a community, to a parent, to a teacher when they're choosing an intervention. And I should note one big challenge here is that their dollars around interventions are controlled at a different level than in the US. So it's important to note that. But I think there's some really good insights there, right? The things that matter are what's the strength of the evidence base, and there's a sliding scale, right? It's a degree of evidence. And so you can toggle between educated hypotheses and RCTs. What's the cost, including the cost of implementation now, the training costs, the total cost of implementation? And then what's the effect size or amount of growth that you can generate or expect to generate in a level of months? Mm-hmm. And then there's some contextual factors that they share as well. Where has this worked before? What environments does it work in? What are some case studies and examples of effective implementation? So right now, I think actually we have a big problem, which is why it's really important that we invest in our infrastructure and federal R&D right now. We don't have the infrastructure to support this type of spectrum of evidence. We have the What Works Clearinghouse, we have ERIC, but we need to be thinking about the knowledge mobilization and dissemination that makes it easier for people to consume information about what might work and then what they can expect. And it's not just to teachers and educators, it's to communities and families and maybe even students themselves.
Okay, I want to come back to that in a second, but I got to give Mark a chance now. You just gave him a big challenge. You got a big challenge from Deborah, but you just gave Mark a big challenge. What do you think about that? That proposition?
Okay, so Erin is like feeding me lines that she knows I'm going to like swing at and hopefully hit. Okay, so look, I mean, we know, and Erin's, talking about the EEF, the Education Endowment Foundation. We've been there many times. We're in touch with them all the time. I mean, their toolkits, we've adopted the development of toolkits. Their work is really very interesting. If you don't know the EEF, you should go look them up. That's number one. Number two, the FDA or whatever. So that's a nice dream. We could keep dreaming it. But the plan. So I don't know how many of you know the SEER principles that we're up to 9 SEER principles, and they're called Standards for Education, Standards and Excellence in Education Research. So some of these are like normal science, pre-registration, right? Some of them are more challenging, but the way of the future. And actually it's going to be in a lot of our work, we're running up against open data and open science and proprietary information. So this is, I mean, that's going to have to be worked out. That's clearly an issue that is, I mean, if the American taxpayer is paying for research, then that work belongs to the American taxpayer, right? But what's the boundary lines between proprietary information and the demands of open science and open open data? I mean, this is going to be fundamental. So when we developed the SEER principles, the goal was actually, the first word is S is standards. So the model that we had was like LEEDs, right? The LEEDs building codes. And you if you hit certain marks, you get a bronze, you hit more, you get silver, you get titanium or whatever you get. So we are slowly turning these principles into more and more standards. So my goal ultimately, which is going to take more years than I'll be here, but I hope it continues. My goal is actually to turn those standards into something that are judgeable, right? And then start awarding gold stars, silver stars, bronze stars, turkeys, or whatever it is, based on on how many principles and how many standards the research meets. I think that's the closest thing we're going to come in the foreseeable future to something like an FDA or a better housekeeping seal of approval. That's what LEEDs is. Right. So I could imagine doing that. So the other thing that, I could imagine doing that. So the other thing that, I could imagine doing that. So the other thing that, I could imagine doing that. So the other thing that, I could imagine doing that. So the other thing that, I could imagine doing that. So the other thing that, I could imagine doing that. So the other thing that, I could imagine doing that. So the other thing that, I could imagine doing that. So the other thing that, I could imagine doing that. So the other thing that, I could imagine doing that. So the other thing that, I could imagine doing that. So the other thing that, I could imagine doing that. So the other thing that, I could imagine doing that. So the other thing that, I could imagine doing that. So the other thing that, I could imagine doing that. So the other thing that, I could imagine doing that. So the other thing that, I could imagine doing that. So the other thing that, I could imagine doing that. So the other thing that, I could imagine doing that. So the other thing that, I could imagine doing that. So the other thing that, I could imagine doing that. So the that I think Erin said this in two different ways, is like, it's not the responsibility of it's not the responsibility of teachers to understand detailed research. It is the responsibility of the researchers that we fund, again, as an applied science agency. It is our responsibility to make sure that the work we do is usable, right? So I ran a company called College Measures. The slogan was, we want data that's useful, usable, and used. Still a good tagline. And we want, it's our responsibility. So I'm gonna trash talk academics, right? I mean, academics want to take our money, do a research paper, publish it in some obscure journal, get tenure, and rinse and repeat, as they say, right? But that's not, as an applied science agency, that's not our business.
Right.
Our
right.
business is
Sure.
is turning science, even the most basic science that we support, because we do support that, but it has to be turned into products, reports, information that is accessible and usable. And that's a big challenge.
It is a big challenge. I agree. So let me, you all know that one of the cornerstones of the campaign is the power of parents as educators, not just supporters of education and partners in educators, partners with educators, but as educators themselves. And I wonder how you think about all of this. A lot of this conversation today has been about adoption by institutions and by people in institutions, but what can we do? And I'd like to just do a rapid fire around the horn here. To get information in the hands of parents, actionable information in the hands of parents not as advocates and not as partners, but parents as educators. And we're short on time, so I'm gonna come to you, Deborah, to start, and Sierra, I see when it is, so I think we should post the reaction poll now. Thanks so much. Go ahead, Deborah.
Yeah, I'll just quickly say that I think back to the point of funds of knowledge and helping the community understand that they have valuable information and experiences to share. Often families who have immigrated from other countries where they held positions of stature in their country, and now they're not in this country because of a language barrier, not intellect or intelligence.
Yep.
Helping teachers recognize that that's an opportunity to celebrate by having them coming into classrooms and sharing, and children recognizing that they bring valuable information and experiences to the classroom as well, and honoring that. So that's one part, but parent education is also another part of it, and opportunities to loop them in, whether it is through newsletters, workshops, not just a math night, but just ongoing communication, hosting different events for them to have an opportunity to engage with what their children are learning. The parents that are yelling, oh, who changed math? What is this new math? Help them understand that it's not new math. And if they hated math and they don't hate their children, they shouldn't be fighting for them to be taught the exact same way they were. Just putting that out there. But helping them understand why, and helping them have those experiences that are positive and engaging, and including and respecting them as people in the community who have something to offer, degrees in this country or not.
Great. Awesome. Thank you. Rebecca, when you think about the Learn Network, do you only think about professionals, or do you think about the dispersion of information and ideas to parents in their role?
Well, I can give us a concrete example. One of the product teams that we're supporting is a program to support tutors, and they're converting it from a paper-based program to being available digitally to get this out into many more schools.
Great.
But the goal is to provide tools to help a variety of kinds of tutors. Could be parents, could be classroom assistants, to provide more effective tutoring to students. And I think, to Mark's earlier point, a lot of us as parents, we read with our children, but we didn't know how to teach our children to read. And so having some tools to help us do a better job of that would be great.
Fantastic. Erin, how do you think about parents in this equation?
Well, I think they're essential. So +1 to both of the comments of my previous panelists. But one thing I want to shout out is I'm really loved in school districts. And one of the innovations I want to shout out is the availability of giving data into the hands of parents and students about their own learning. You know, one of the things about the NAEP scores is that for all of us, we're saying they were shocking, but not surprising. I think in places where communities like LAUSD and others got data in the hands of parents throughout the pandemic about how their students were doing and engaged parents in a conversation. Not only did they see they didn't see the type of whiplash in their scores, but actually parents were engaged in the conversation about what the pathway forward is. And so there's one thing I think a superintendent can do is ask yourself, how are you putting the data that you have access to right now in the hands of parents and teachers so that you can start that conversation and have a conversation with parents, see them as partners, not adversaries, see them as advocates for one team, which is the learning of kids, which we're all super invested in.
Awesome. Erin, Mark, you get the last word.
I get the last word. I have the least to say about this one. So no, we're a very small science agency. That is true. We are, and most of the research is being done with field initiated. That is, we put out RFAs and people come in, and they're mostly academics or big research houses, the SRI, AIR, RTI, the standard list. There is a fundamental reorientation that's needed because we are an applied science agency. I've said this like 4 times now.
Yep.
But we can't forget the fact that we are an applied science agency. Our goal is to change facts on the ground. But here's the problem. We actually had we had McKinsey come in and do an audience study for us. Like, we're given our limited resources, who should we be targeting? Who should we be talking to? Parents are just, I love everybody here. I love what Erin's doing. I love what Deborah's, getting out in 16,000 school districts and changing facts on the ground that way is fundamentally important. But we can't do that work. We don't have boots on the ground. We don't have, we're not a campaign organization. So that's sort of like a reality check. But we've done nowhere near enough work about school districts, right?
Yep.
So for just one thing. So when I was in graduate school in political science, there was a little spurt of work on school boards.
Yep.
And then it just sort of disappeared. We have not invested in school boards, in any research in school boards, in God knows how long. Well, I think half of the problems that we're talking about cannot be addressed unless we understand more about how school boards function and what the dynamics are, what the legal context that they face is, how they make their choices, what kind of information they need. So we're trying to figure out what the best way to we're a fairly large investor, but $10 million. Like if we put $10 million on the table and said, we need research on how school boards make decisions, how to get them to do the sort of things that Deborah was talking about, like, adopting evidence-based. It was like we spent 10, 15 minutes on this, right? So what can we do? What can we do with increasing our understanding of the dynamics of school boards, right? And how they make decisions and who makes decisions.
Yep.
So I went to some ed tech conference, and everybody expected me to talk to the scientists. I didn't. I went and I talked to all of the salespeople. It was an incredibly eye-opening experience. Like, okay, you're one of the largest suppliers of ed tech, of curriculum, of all this. Like, who buys the stuff that you're selling? And what are the criteria, right? And I'm going to, the answer in many cases, way too much, is I get a call the last day of the fiscal year. They say I have $85,000 left over.
Of course.
I hear experiential classrooms are a big thing. Sell me an experiential classroom.
Right. Of course. All right, folks, this is going to go down in history as one of the most spirited conversations that we've had on a Learning Tuesday. And that is a testament to all of the energy that all of you brought. tons of information, really interesting and useful information, but wow, so much energy. And I want to thank Sarah and Sierra and Becky for all the help in putting this together. I want to thank everybody who's still here for participating in the poll. I love the way that the poll helped guide the conversation and helped, prompted some questions and some answers from our group. So that was fantastic. You see on screen some of our upcoming GLR Learning Tuesday webinars, and we hope you will join us for those. And again, thank you to all our guests today and to everybody who participated. So long.